Before dawn, the house was cold enough to hurt the hands. Barbara Ross knelt in the front passage with a pail of grey water and a brush gone soft at the edges, working mud from the white-veined marble in circles so small they might have been pennants. The mud had come from her stepmother's guests the evening before. Boots and hems and careless laughter ground into stone imported at absurd expense by Barbara's late father, who had once forbidden even servants to scrub it on their knees for fear they would chill themselves. Now Barbara knelt where she had once flown. When she was a child, she had raced that passage in slippers, ribbons coming loose, pursued by a father who pretended to lose and laughed when she took sanctuary behind the long case clock. He had called her his little steward, his solemn-eyed girl who counted pears in the orchard and remembered promises better than most attorneys remembered fees. He had been in his grave 18 months. "Miss Ross." The title came clipped and mocking from above her, and Barbara looked up to see Brindle, the housekeeper, a shawl pinned hard across her broad chest, regarding the floor with professional dissatisfaction. "You missed along the skirting." Barbara set the brush back into the pail and dragged it along the baseboard until the grime gave way. Her wrists ached from laundry done by candlelight. Her stomach clenched and unclenched with the old dull bite of hunger. She had given her supper to the scullery girl, who had a fever and no mother in service to plead for her. Charity made one weak by morning, but she had never learned the opposite art. Brindle sniffed. "Lady Ross rises early today. See the morning room laid and the coals made up, and do not be seen by Mrs. Darnley when she calls. Her ladyship says your face lowers the cheer." Barbara lowered her eyes because that was easier than allowing the anger to show. "Yes, Brindle." "Plain," Lady Ross called her. Plain as porridge, plain as rainwater, plain as duty. Her circle had taken it up like a parlour game. Barbara had heard herself assessed over tea as though she were china with a hairline crack, useful for every day, never for display. Yet now and then a stranger, tradesman, visiting cousin, curate's wife, would pause and look twice, as if uncertain what did not fit the verdict. Her dark hair was almost black when unpowdered. Her face, too pale from labour and missed meals, had the fine, severe lines of a cameo not yet cut. Her eyes, wide and grave, gave her an expression people mistook for hauteur when it was mostly restraint. She stood too quickly, and the world tilted. A white flare crossed her vision. She caught the edge of the console table before the pail could overturn. Brindle watched with narrowed suspicion. "If you mean to swoon, do it in the servants' hall, not on the marble." "I'm quite well," Barbara said, and waited for the room to settle into shape again. By 6, she had laid the morning-room fire, polished the silver urn, carried up hot water, mended a torn cuff, and folded 3 days' newspapers whose politics she was no longer permitted to discuss. By 7, Lady Ross swept in, trailing scent and rustling black silk, elegant as an accusation. "You look as if you have slept in ashes," Lady Ross said, taking the chair nearest the hearth. "A pity you had your father's eyes before grief enlarged them so theatrically." Barbara poured tea with steady hands. "Will there be callers this morning?" "There will be sensible women, if not interesting ones." Lady Ross accepted her cup and regarded her over the rim. "And Mr. Pritchard calls afternoon." The name struck like cold water. Mr. Pritchard, twice widowed, 50 if he was a day, with damp hands and a habit of touching sleeve and elbow as though testing cloth for purchase. He held notes against the Ross estate, and made no secret that he preferred settlement by marriage to delayed payment. Lady Ross had begun speaking of him as if he were weather, inevitable, unpleasant, to be endured with proper shawls. "He need not call for me," Barbara said. "For whom then? The china shepherdess on the mantel." Lady Ross set down her cup with a hard click. "You are 22 penniless and inconvenient. You have no portion and no protector. The entail secures this house to your father's cousin's line after me. I have only my jointure and my wit to keep us from vulgarity. Mr. Pritchard offers terms. You will not force me to beg because you prefer romance." Barbara kept her voice low. "My father intended—" "Your father intended many foolish things," Lady Ross snapped. "He died before he could execute half of them, and we are left with facts." Facts! Barbara could recite them better than anyone in the house. Fact! She owned nothing she wore except a pair of plain kid gloves gone shiny at the fingers. Fact! Every letter addressed to her came opened. Fact! She had once signed household accounts at her father's side. Now she scrubbed the floors she had crossed as his daughter. Fact! The only remnant of her old life lay hidden beneath the loose floorboard under her narrow bed. A leather ledger in her father's neat hand, with columns precise as cathedral lines and occasional notes in the margin. Ask Barbara to check wheat yields in East Field. She catches what men miss. At night she took it out like contraband and traced those notes until the candle guttered. It was the nearest thing she had to being seen. Lady Ross dabbed her lips and held out a sealed note. "You will take this to Mr. Greaves in Bell Thread Lane, at once." Barbara hesitated. "In this weather?" Sleet struck the window in rattling bursts. The sky was the colour of pewter. "Do you fear getting wet?" Lady Ross smiled, without warmth. "Then marry money quickly and ride covered. Until then, walk." The note was thick, heavily sealed. Barbara took it. "Shall I wait for a reply?" "If he gives one. And Barbara," Lady Ross's tone turned almost fond, which was always a warning, "do not linger where gentlemen gather. We have enough trouble finding one willing to overlook your deficiencies." Barbara curtsied and left before she answered with something unforgivable. Outside, the morning bit through wool and skin. She wrapped her cloak tighter, lowered her head, and went on foot through lanes slick with half-frozen muck, past shuttered shops and milk carts, past the churchyard where the stones shone dark with wet. Bellthread Lane lay beyond the market quarter, narrower and meaner than anything Lady Ross would ever admit knowing. By the time Barbara reached it, her hem was soaked to the knee. Greaves's office was closed. A boy with a basket of eels told her the broker had gone overnight to a gaming house near the river and would not be sober before noon. Barbara stood under a dripping eave with Lady Ross's sealed note in her glove, considering whether to wait, return, or lie. She hated lying, but she had learned that truth in Lady Ross's house was often treated as insolence. She turned toward home by the back lane, where traffic was lighter. The sleet had thickened. Little needles of ice stung her cheeks. Ahead, where the lane dipped and curved along a flooded ditch, a carriage stood at an impossible angle. One wheel sunk deep in mud. The horses gone, traces snapping in the wind like whips. For a heartbeat she thought it abandoned. Then she heard a man cry out, not loud, but raw. Barbara ran. The coachman lay thrown clear, half in the water at the lane's edge, blood matted in his hair. Beneath the tilted carriage body a gentleman was pinned at the shoulder and hip, one arm flung out into the slush. His coat, once dark blue and expensive, was torn and soaked nearly black. Blood spread from beneath his left shoulder in a steady, shocking bloom. "Can you hear me?" Barbara dropped to her knees in mud. His eyes opened grey and hard even through pain. "Get away from the wheel," he said through clenched teeth. "If it slips, it will crush you." She looked around wildly. No one on the road, no sound but sleet and the ditch water. "Can you move your legs?" "Not enough." The wheel had wedged against a stone post. If she could lever it up, no, too heavy. She scrambled to the rear, braced both hands under the carriage step, and heaved. It shifted an inch, her boots slid. Again. Wood groaned. The gentleman swore, shoved with his free arm, and with a tearing sound dragged himself clear as the wheel dropped back into mire. He tried to rise and nearly went down. Barbara got his arm over her shoulder, smaller by far, but steadier than she looked. "There's an inn 1/2 mile back," she said. "Can you walk?" "I can, if you stop talking to me as though I'm delicate." "Then walk." He gave a short, incredulous breath that might have been a laugh and let her haul him toward the road. She looked once at the coachman, cursed under her breath, and ran back. He was breathing, shallow but present. She could not carry 2 grown men. She dragged him by the coat as far from the water as she could, propped his head on her cloak bundle, and told herself it would have to do until she returned. The inn they reached was no place for ladies in the middle of the day, much less in weather that kept decent company home. Low-beamed, close-smelling, lit by rushlights and kitchen fire. At that hour, only the landlord's wife and a yawning maid were about. Their eyes sharpened at once at the sight of Barbara, wet, dishevelled, with a bleeding gentleman leaning hard against her. "He needs a surgeon," Barbara said, "and heat! Quickly!" The wife shouted for her husband. They got him into the kitchen settle. Blood had soaked through linen and waistcoat. The wound at his shoulder looked ugly, but not, thank God, arterial. Barbara tore strips from the inner petticoat no one would see beneath her skirt and bound him as tightly as she dared, while the innkeeper muttered about authorities and trouble and whether the constable must be fetched. "Fetch whomever you like," Barbara said, fingers slick and shaking. "But if you stand there naming trouble instead of bringing clean water, he may die, while you choose." Something in her tone moved him. Water came and rough brandy, and finally a boy sent running for the surgeon and for help with the coachman. Time stretched strangely after that. Firelight, steam, groans, the gentleman drifting in and out while Barbara sat upright on a stool and refused sleep. If she closed her eyes, she might fail him. If she left, the room would begin to ask questions in earnest. Questions came anyway. By 3 that afternoon, 2 ostlers and a carter had wandered in, drawn by accident and weather. They stared, whispered, looked from the gentleman's signet ring to Barbara's bare left hand, to the state of her gown, to the private room the innkeeper grudgingly offered when he realised who might be bleeding on his settle. "Wife, maybe," one said too loudly, "or worse." Barbara heard every word and kept binding compresses. Dusk seeped at last through the small panes, colourless and unforgiving. The surgeon had come and gone, pronouncing the shoulder-flesh wound painful, but survivable, the coachman concussed, but living. The gentleman woke as the innkeeper entered with broth and curiosity. He took in the room in one swift survey. Innkeeper at the threshold with sharp eyes, maid behind him, gaping, Barbara sitting rigid in a borrowed chair, with her hair coming loose and petticoat hem ragged where she had torn it for bandages. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, but command still lived in it. "My wife has sat up all night. Fetch broth and leave us." The innkeeper blinked, then bowed by instinct to rank he had not yet confirmed. "Yes, sir, at once, sir." He backed out, pulling the maid with him. The door shut. Silence thudded in the wake of it. The gentleman closed his eyes briefly, as if against pain or calculation, then looked at Barbara directly. In daylight she could see him better. Perhaps 30, clean-shaven, features cut too sharply to be called handsome in any easy way. Intelligence sat in his face like a blade. "I told them you were my wife. Forgive me," he said. Barbara's mouth parted, but no words came. The single word wife rang through her like struck metal. In that house, in her world, reputation was coin and chain both. A woman might lose it once and never buy back so much as decent indifference. If the innkeeper believed the claim, her name was tied now to an unknown man. If he doubted it, she was compromised more thoroughly still. Alone for hours with a gentleman, clothing in disarray, no chaperone, no witness kind enough to defend her motives against appetite for scandal. Either way, tongues would feast. And home? Home was Lady Ross, who would not ask whether she had saved a life before deciding how best to spend the story. She thought of Mr. Pritchard's damp hand closing on her sleeve. She thought of Lady Ross saying family survival, as if it meant Barbara's surrender and no one else's inconvenience. She thought of the hidden ledger beneath the floorboard, of her father's handwriting steady as faith. At last she found enough voice to whisper, "Do you know what you have done?" He held her gaze. "Yes!" Outside the door someone laughed in the passage and said, "His lordship's lady, imagine that!" His lordship. The room seemed to tilt again, though this time hunger had little to do with it. Barbara sat very still, her fingers locked together so tightly, her knuckles whitened, and understood with dreadful clarity that one sentence, spoken to save her, might yet unmake what remained of her life. Barbara did not realise she was standing until the chair legs scraped the boards. The gentleman's expression did not change, but he lifted his uninjured hand slightly, either in warning or apology. "Sit down. If you faint now, all my theatrics are wasted." "I do not faint," she said, and sat because her knees had begun to tremble. A knock sounded before either could add to the ruin. The innkeeper came in with a tray, wife and maid crowding behind him, their curiosity scrubbed into respect by the word lordship and a glimpse of expensive linen. "Broth, sir? Bread? We have sent for dry wood and clean sheets." His eyes slid to Barbara and back. "Shall I bring some for your lady as well?" "Yes," the gentleman said evenly, "and ink." When they had gone again, Barbara spoke low and furious. "You compound one lie with another." "I contain it," he replied. "There is a difference." "For whom?" "For you first, then for us both." She gave a small disbelieving laugh. "You do not know me." "No," he said. "I know what room we are in, what hour it is, and what men do with stories about women they cannot control." She could not answer that. It was too exactly true. He shifted, jaw tightening as pain took hold. "Your name?" "Barbara Ross." His gaze sharpened. "Ross of Blackthorn Hall?" She stared at him. "You know it." "I know the estate and the litigation that followed your father's death." A pause. "I am Adrian Kestrel." The name landed a heartbeat before the title she had just heard in the passage. Kestrel, Wrexham. The Earl watched her understand. "Yes," he said softly. "That one." Barbara pressed her palms to her skirt to still them. "If you are who you say, your word will outweigh mine 10 times over. If you tell them tomorrow I am nothing to you, no one will call you liar. They will call you worse." He did not flinch from it, which made it harder to despise him. Harder, too, to forgive. The ink came. So did a man in livery, mud-spattered and white with shock, who dropped to one knee at the door and called, "My lord!" Wrexham cut him off. "Mason! Up! Report!" Within minutes the room became a command post. Orders went out for the damaged carriage, for the coachman's care, for payment to the inn, for silence from servants so sternly worded. Barbara wondered if silence could be purchased at all. Wrexham signed notes with his left hand, the script still precise though slower. When he had dismissed the last man, Barbara rose. "I'm going home." His eyes lifted. "Are you?" "Yes." "To Lady Ross?" He said the name as if selecting a tool. "Will she protect you?" Barbara looked away. He continued, voice matter of fact. "By morning this inn will have supplied details to half the county. By noon there will be additions. By evening there will be certainties. If you return alone, your stepmother may find you useful only if she can sell your usefulness quickly." Mr. Pritchard's damp fingers seemed to brush her sleeve again. "I cannot simply vanish into your household," she said. "You can if the alternative is social execution." The words were cold. The intent, unexpectedly, was not. Before she could decide whether to fight him further, another commotion rose from below. Wheels, voices, the high carrying tones of outrage. The innkeeper flung open the door without ceremony. "Lady Ross, sir." "She insists!" Lady Ross swept in behind him, wrapped in sable and indignation, cheeks bright with cold and triumph. She did not curtsy. She did not look at Barbara first. She looked at Wrexham, measured rank in an instant, and shifted to grieving propriety. "My lord, what a distressing scene! I came as soon as I heard my poor stepdaughter had entangled herself in this." Barbara felt the trap close, like wire. Lady Ross's gaze cut to her, glittering. "Child, what have you done?" "Gone all night from home in an inn with a gentleman. You have killed us." Wrexham answered before Barbara could. "Miss Ross prevented my death in a flooded lane." Lady Ross laid a hand theatrically to her breast. "How noble! How improbable! I fear her imagination has always exceeded her sense." Barbara's breath caught, then steadied. "You sent me to Belthread Lane in sleet with a sealed note and no escort." Lady Ross ignored her. "My lord, I must insist she return with me at once." "She is not mistress of herself. She is promised." "Promised to whom?" Wrexham asked. "A respectable widower of means." "Name." Lady Ross hesitated a fraction too long. "Mr. Pritchard." "Ah!" That single syllable contained contempt so polished it almost passed for civility. "She is under my protection," he said. Lady Ross's smile thinned. "On what authority?" "On mine." The silence that followed was brittle as ice. Lady Ross recovered first, turning to Barbara with a hiss beneath her breath. "Do not be a fool. Men tire of scandals. Debts remain." Wrexham's voice remained level. "Any debt instrument concerning Miss Ross may be sent to my solicitor for examination." Lady Ross spun back, now openly hostile. "You have been deceived, my lord. She is crafty when cornered." "I have observed Miss Ross under pressure," he said. "Crafty is not the word I'd select." Barbara felt the heat rise in her face despite herself. Lady Ross saw it and smiled, a mean, private little smile that promised retribution. "Very well, keep her. London will strip the varnish in a week." She turned and departed in a rustle of silk and fury. When the door shut, Barbara let out a breath she had been holding since dawn. Wrexham leaned back, colour gone harder in his face. "She will not stop," he said. "No." "Then we do not give her a closed room to work in." He looked at her directly. "You will go to London, not with me, with my mother. She is difficult, unimpressed by scandal and bulletproof. Stay in her house until this can be managed." Managed, as if her life were an estate dispute. Yet, in his mouth, it sounded like a promise, not dismissal. Barbara nodded once. "I will not be hidden." A faint, unexpected curve touched one corner of his mouth. "Good. Hidden things are easiest to bury." London did what London always did with novelty. It fed. By the time Barbara entered the Dowager Countess of Wrexham's house in Grosvenor Square, the lie had grown limbs. Market women dipped curtsies and called her "my lady" with wicked delight. A pamphlet sold outside a coffee house speculated on a clandestine wedding performed by moonlight over a gaming table. A caricature in a print shop window showed a gaunt girl in servants' aprons climbing into an earl's coronet as if it were a hay cart. The Dowager Countess, Lady Helena, received Barbara in a drawing-room pale as frost, looked her up and down once and said, "You have your own face. Keep it. Sit." It was, Barbara learned, approval. Life in Grosvenor Square was a strict machinery of calls, cards, and strategic visibility. Lady Helena insisted Barbara appear at the right hours with the right company and the wrong degree of apology. "If you skulk, they smell blood," she said, pinning a cap with military precision. "If you preen, they sharpen knives. Therefore, composure." Composure took work. At routs and teas, women smiled with all their teeth and asked whether country air had inspired Barbara's adventure. Men bowed too low and addressed their remarks to her shoulders. One old duchess peered through a quizzing glass and announced, "Not pretty enough for ambition. How refreshing." Letters from Lady Ross arrived daily, each one more desperate and venomous than the last. One demanded her immediate return before permanent disgrace. Another enclosed copies of debt notes, figures inflated, and signatures suspiciously neat, claiming Barbara's duty was to marry Mr. Pritchard without delay for family survival. Lady Helena read them, snorted, and fed them to the fire one by one. Wrexham himself was present and absent in equal measure, seen at dinner with his injured arm in a sling, then gone before coffee, heard issuing instructions to solicitors behind closed library doors, encountered in hallways where he would incline his head and ask, "Are you tolerably armed for tonight?" as if society were a battlefield and lace acceptable armour. The worst of it came at Lady Ventnor's assembly, where heat and perfume made the air cloying. Barbara stood beside a marble chimney, listening to a baronet's wife explain in syrup tones that accidental marriages were all the cry when a young man with a smooth face and inherited confidence drifted close with two companions. "Ross, is it?" he drawled loudly enough for 3 circles to hear. "Or should one say stable wife in borrowed silk?" His friends laughed. Barbara turned to him. He wore the ribbon of a viscount's son and the expression of one who had never met consequence. "Borrowed?" she said softly. "No. Lady Wrexham lent me this gown outright. I am told your tailor still waits on settlement from last season. Perhaps that is what you mean by borrowed." The laughter changed direction in a single delicious snap. The young man flushed scarlet. "How dare! You invited scrutiny," Barbara said, still quiet. "You cannot complain at seeing what you offered." He choked on a reply and retreated under the weight of too many watching eyes. When Barbara looked up, she found Wrexham across the room, one hand braced on his cane, speaking to no one. He had heard. For the first time since the inn, his face lost its careful neutrality. Respect, unguarded and clear, crossed it like sunlight. He did not smile. He inclined his head once, as one equal acknowledges another. It steadied her more than praise could have done, but Lady Ross did not relent. She began calling at houses where Barbara was expected, arriving in black silk and maternal anguish, hinting that the girl had always been unstable, that papers had gone missing, that a nobleman's generosity had been misinterpreted. The story shifted from romance to fraud, and the shift was dangerous. One wet afternoon, seeking quiet from it, Barbara asked leave to use Wrexham's library. Lady Helena waved her in with a "Try not to reorganize the empire." The room smelled of leather, paper, and rain. Barbara moved along shelves not to pry but to breathe. Yet near the escritoire lay an open packet of estate correspondence awaiting dispatch, neatly tied. One folded sheet had slipped loose, exposing a familiar name in a solicitor's angular hand: Blackthorn Hall, codicil not entered with principal will. Barbara froze. She read the line again, pulse thudding. Codicil not entered. With trembling fingers she drew the letter fully into light. It was from a law clerk to Wrexham's man of business, querying irregular references in old county records. Mention of a supplemental instrument executed 3 months before Mr. Ross's death, granting Miss Barbara Ross a dowry sum and life interest in the dower house, provided certain trusts remained solvent. Barbara sank into the chair as if her bones had gone out from under her. All at once fragments she had lived with for months aligned. Lady Ross's haste to dismiss old clerks, locked cabinets, abruptly lost papers, furious insistence that no provision existed for Barbara beyond charity marriage. Facts, indeed. She pulled from her reticule the small leather ledger she had finally had delivered from Blackthorn in a trunk of winter things. Her father's hand waited there, calm and exact. In the margin beside rents and wheat tallies, one note she had read 100 times and never understood in full: transfer agreed per codicil. B.R. secured if H behaves honestly. If not, ledger plus Toller copies. Toller, their former steward, retired to his daughter's cottage 2 villages over. Barbara pressed her fingertips to the page until the shaking slowed. Lady Ross had not merely been cruel, she had stolen. That evening at Lady Parminter's musicale, the rooms were overfull and gold with candlelight. Singers trilled in the music room, while in the adjoining salon, people performed conversation with predatory attention. Barbara had just accepted lemonade when Lady Ross appeared before her in widow's black and righteous fury, voice sharpened for audience. "There she is," she announced, "the child who absconded with household papers and now blackens my name to extort a peer." Heads turned, as if pulled by string. Barbara set down her glass. "You should lower your voice." "I will not." Lady Ross stepped closer. "Tell them how you trapped him in that inn. Tell them what you stole from my desk." A ring of listeners formed, delighted and appalled. Barbara opened her mouth. Before she spoke, Wrexham moved through the crowd and came to stand at her side, not in front of her. His cane struck the parquet once. The room quieted. His voice carried without effort. "Permit me to simplify this for everyone present. Miss Ross is the lady whose honour I shall defend before any man in this room." Silence fell hard. Lady Ross laughed, brittle and high. "How gallant! How compromising!" Wrexham did not look at her. He looked at the onlookers, one by one, and continued, "Any allegation regarding theft, extortion, or deceit will be directed to my solicitors in writing. Anonymous whispers will be treated as cowardice. Public slander will be answered publicly." No one moved. No one breathed loudly enough to be heard. Barbara stood very still beside him, the shock of being believed almost painful. Lady Ross's mouth worked. No sound came. At last she gathered her skirts and withdrew under 100 avid eyes. Her retreat less dignified than a flight. Music resumed eventually, thin and uncertain. Later, in the dark of Wrexham's carriage, wheels humming over wet stones, neither spoke for several streets. Then Barbara said, "You did not have to do that." "Yes," he said, "I did." She turned toward him. In the passing light, his face looked tired, stripped of polish. "At the inn," he said quietly, "I did not lie only to spare gossip. I saw you drag me out from under a carriage in sleet and order grown men twice your size, as if life were too urgent for their pride. I called you my wife because it was the fastest shield I had to hand." He paused. "And because I knew my name can force as well as protect. I have not wanted to become another man who corners you and calls it care." The honesty landed more deeply than declaration. Barbara held his gaze. "Then do not corner me." "I won't." She looked down at her gloved hands, then back up, voice steadier than she felt. "Lady Ross forged debts. She concealed a codicil to my father's will. I can prove it." For the first time that night, something like fierce satisfaction lit his eyes. "Good," he said. "Then we stop surviving and start prosecuting." By the time the carriage turned into Grosvenor Square, Barbara no longer felt like prey. Fear remained, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the fear of being hunted in private rooms. It was the sharper, cleaner fear that comes just before one chooses to fight in daylight. The carriage lamps swept across the wet stone of Grosvenor Square and died as they drew up before Lady Helena's steps. Before the footman could lower the stairs, the front door opened. Lady Helena stood in the light, still in evening silk, as if she had not undressed because she expected bad news and meant to meet it upright. "You are 10 minutes late," she said as Barbara and Wrexham entered, "which, in this house, means disaster." Wrexham handed his cane and gloves to the butler. "How severe?" "2 callers after 11, 3 notes, 1 messenger from your solicitor, and an article in the Evening Gazette written by a man who should be horsewhipped for punctuation alone." She held out a folded broadsheet to Barbara. "Read." Barbara did. Halfway down the column her vision sharpened to a hard, narrow tunnel. Country miss of uncertain station, cultivated acquaintance with a noble invalid, removed private documents from her guardian's desk, now pressing improper claims on an ancient family estate. At the end, in italics like a smirk, an honourable marriage might regularise what impropriety began. Mr. Pritchard did not need to be named. His terms were there all the same. Wrexham took the paper from her and tossed it into the fire. "Gazette can be sued." "Not before breakfast," Lady Helena replied. "Before breakfast we have this." She passed him a sealed legal packet. "Filed this afternoon in Bow Street and copied to the Ross trustees." He read, face cooling line by line. Then he handed it to Barbara. "Lady Ross, through counsel, formally accused Barbara of removing household papers, forging a codicil, and attempting to extort money and marriage from the Earl of Wrexham by threatening scandal. She requested immediate recovery of documents, restraint of disbursements from any Ross trust, and an inquiry into Barbara's fitness for independent management. Fitness! As though she were a horse at auction. Barbara folded the document carefully, because if she did not, her hands would shake. "She means to bury me in process," she said. "If she makes me look unstable or criminal, no trustee will release a penny even if the codicil is proved." "And if she convinces one magistrate that you forged papers," Lady Helena said bluntly, "you could be held pending hearing. Men call it caution. Women call it a cell." Wrexham was already moving toward the writing table. "I want Finch here now." "He is in the blue parlour," Lady Helena said. "With another kindness, your 2 dismissed grooms have signed affidavits for Lady Ross." Wrexham stopped. "Affidavits to what?" Barbara asked. "That they heard you, Miss Ross," Lady Helena said, watching her steadily. "Boast in the inn-yard that you would be Countess by Michaelmas if you played tiers correctly." For a moment Barbara could only stare. It was so vulgar, so unlike anything she would ever say, that it took a beat to understand how effective it would be. Not because it was believable, because it was enjoyable. People loved stories that punished women for wanting. Wrexham swore softly, and in a language Barbara did not know. Finch came in within minutes, spectacles askew, carrying 3 leather folders and the exhausted look of a man who had run all evening on indignation. He bowed quickly. "My lord, Miss Ross, we must assume Lady Ross and Mr. Pritchard are coordinating. Someone paid for speed. The petition reached a magistrate known to dine with Pritchard's banker. "Can he issue warrants tonight?" Wrexham asked. "He can issue search authority by dawn." Barbara stepped forward. "Then we cannot wait. The clerk's letter mentioned Toller copies. If Lady Ross learns that, she will destroy them." "I have already sent a rider," Finch said. No answer yet. Wrexham looked at Barbara. "Where is your father's ledger now?" "In my room. Locked case." "Bring it here." She hesitated, then nodded and went herself rather than send a maid. When she returned, the ledger felt heavier than leather, and paper had any right to feel. Wrexham took it with uncharacteristic care, opened to the inside cover, then shut it again and handed it back. "Keep this on your person," he said. "No trunk, no desk." By midnight, instructions flew through the house, copied letters, dispatched clerks, messengers on fresh horses. Lady Helena cancelled 2 social engagements and accepted 3 others with predatory calm. "If they think we are retreating," she said, "they will assume guilt and bring sandwiches." Yet by morning the first damage had landed. 3 invitations vanished. One trustee sent a polite, poisonously neutral note suspending consideration of Barbara's claim pending clarification of allegations. And at 10 o'clock, 2 Bow Street officers arrived with authority to inspect Miss Ross's effects for misappropriated instruments. Wrexham met them in the hall, coat buttoned, expression arctic. "You may search in my steward's presence," he said. "You may not touch a single item without inventory." The older officer, Sergeant Pell, showed the paper and did not bow. "Authority includes seizure, my lord." Barbara stood at the stairhead, ledger hidden under her shawl, and watched men she did not know open drawers containing the last scraps of her old life, her mother's miniature, 2 letters in her father's hand, stockings she had darned herself, a ribbon box with no ribbons left worth keeping. Pell lifted each page and held it up to the light as if guilt had watermark. In the escritoire they found the loose clerk's letter mentioning blackthorn and codicil. Pell smiled thinly. "Useful." "It is correspondence to my solicitor," Wrexham snapped. "It is now potential evidence." He took it. When they asked for any personal account books, Barbara's throat closed. She kept her face still and said, "I have none relevant." Pell looked at her, unconvinced. "If one appears later, miss, concealment will be added." After they left, taking 2 bundles of papers and a piece of Barbara's composure with them, silence held the drawing-room like smoke. Then Finch returned from the country and made it worse. "Toller is gone," he said, without preamble. "Cottage ransacked, daughter struck, alive but concussed. Neighbours saw a closed chaise before dawn, with Pritchard's man riding behind. No one admits recognising faces." Barbara gripped the back of a chair. "Did they take papers?" "Trunk broken, empty." For the first time since the inn, Barbara sat because she had to. Everything she had built in weeks, visibility, a sliver of credibility, the beginnings of legal footing, felt as if it had been kicked out from under her by boots she could not even name. If Toller was missing and papers seized and servants bought, Lady Ross could turn every delay into presumption of guilt. She heard Lady Helena speaking, practical, cutting, alive with strategy. But the words came through wool. Search writ, counter-petition, injunction challenge, witness lists, dates. A maid brought tea, no one drank. By afternoon, pamphlets were back on the corners. One sketch depicted Barbara with a key in one hand and a coronet in the other, standing on an old widow's neck. At dusk, when the house finally thinned of clerks, Barbara carried the ledger to her room and locked the door. She set it on the bed, sat beside it, and bowed over it until her forehead rested on the worn leather. "I am trying," she whispered to no one living. I am trying exactly as you taught me, and they are faster." There was a knock. Wrexham's voice quiet through the panel. "May I come in?" She did not answer at once, then, "Yes." He entered without hat or coat, shoulders tight with contained violence. He saw her face and stopped. "I can move you tonight," he said, "to one of my smaller houses, fewer eyes." "No." Her voice surprised her by being steady. "Running now would look like confession." "Yes." She looked up sharply. "You agree?" "I agree appearances are weapons. I also agree you're tired enough to bleed if someone speaks too loudly." A tired laugh escaped her despite everything. It hurt. "I thought once we had proof," she said, touching the ledger. "Truth would be hard but simple." "Truth is simple," he said. "Proving it is administrative." She shut her eyes briefly. "I cannot ask your mother to keep me if this becomes criminal." "Do not decide for my mother what she enjoys. She has been waiting 20 years for a worthy legal brawl." That drew almost a smile. Almost. When he left, she lay down fully dressed and did not sleep. Near midnight, Adrian sat alone in the library with a lamp turned low, and his shoulder burning in rhythmic mean pulses that matched his heartbeat. On the desk before him lay two things: Pell's seizure inventory and a stack of invitations declined on the flimsiest pretexts London could invent. He had spent years making himself uninteresting to gossip. Precision, reserve, no scandals offered, no confidences given. Men called him cold because cold could not be manipulated. Cold could not be begged from, seduced, trapped, thanked. Cold did not wake at 2 a.m. hearing an 18-year-old girl say, "Do you know what you have done?" He poured brandy, did not drink it. When Helena entered without knocking, because she never had in his life, he didn't look up. "You're grinding your teeth," she observed. "It makes you look like your father, and no one wants that." He exhaled through his nose. "Pell took privileged papers." "I know. Finch is drafting fury." Adrian pressed thumb and forefinger to his eyes. "I should have anticipated this pace. I underestimated Pritchard." "No," Helena said. "You underestimated what a cornered woman with social credit and no conscience will attempt before she loses both." Silence. Rain tapped the window glass. At last he said, "I have done this before." Helena went very still. "No," she said softly. "Not this. Not the same name. The same error." He hadn't spoken Eleanor Vane's name aloud in years. He did now, quietly, as if saying it might wake someone sleeping in the next room. "When rumours began about her brother's debts, I advised silence until I could settle them privately. I said public contradiction would dignify the lie. I was very proud of the strategy." His mouth twisted. "By the time I spoke, her engagement to me had become a joke in every club. Her father broke it. She married a man who wanted my humiliation as dowry." Helena said nothing. She wrote once, 2 years later, not asking help, just saying she had learned that silence is rarely neutral for women. He swallowed. "She died in childbed before I answered." He did not often allow pain to have grammar. Tonight it came out clipped and spare and far more dangerous for that. "I built this manor after," he said. "Measured, distant, correct. It keeps vultures from circling. It also keeps me from pretending delay is kindness." Helena crossed to the desk and set her hand briefly over his uninjured one, the gesture brisk as ever, the pressure not. "Then do not delay," she said, "and do not confuse guilt with devotion. The first is about your past. The second is about hers." After she left, Adrian sat a long while, listening to rain and the house settling. Then he pulled a sheet of paper toward him and wrote, in a hand steadier than he felt, "Miss Ross, Barbara, if tomorrow worsens, I need you to know I will not make decisions over your head in the name of protection. I have done harm before, with that excuse." He stopped there, sanded the line, folded it, and did not seal it. Morning came grey and sharp. Barbara had just finished a cup of tea she did not want when the butler appeared at the breakfast-room door looking unlike himself, which was to say, disturbed enough to forget discretion. "A man from Pritchard's office, miss. He insists on seeing you. Says his business prevents legal calamity." Wrexham across the table said, "No." Barbara set down her spoon. "Yes, here, with witnesses." The messenger was a narrow man with ink on his cuffs and confidence borrowed from someone richer. He bowed to Barbara, ignored Wrexham at his peril, and presented a folded proposal. "Mr. Pritchard conveys regret at recent unpleasantness," he recited. "He remains willing to settle all disputed debts and withdraw support from Lady Ross's petition if Miss Barbara Ross agrees to immediate marriage settlement and renunciation of any claim under the alleged codicil." Barbara did not touch the paper. "And if I refuse?" The man consulted a second note. "Then additional affidavits will be lodged before noon, alleging attempted blackmail of his lordship and theft of sealed family correspondence. In such event, magistrate review may include temporary confinement pending inquiry. Mr. Pritchard advises cooperation while terms are generous." Wrexham stood so abruptly his chair struck the floor. "Get out!" he said. The messenger backed toward the door. "I am only instructed—" "Out!" He fled. Barbara stared at the unopened proposal as though it might stain the tablecloth by proximity. "So," she said after a moment, "that is the price. Marry the creditor and confess by contract." Wrexham picked up the document with 2 fingers, broke the seal, scanned, and handed it to Finch, who had entered in time to hear the last half. Finch read and went pale with anger. "This is extortion, dressed as settlement." "Can we use it?" Barbara asked. "In a just room?" "Yes." "In today's room?" Finch hesitated. "Perhaps." As if summoned by the word, the knocker thundered. Not a caller's rhythm. Official. Repeated. The butler returned with 2 uniformed officers and a clerk carrying a tin dispatch box. Sergeant Pell was among them, hat in hand this time, but no softer for it. "Miss Barbara Ross," he said, "you are required to appear this afternoon before Magistrate Colne on charges of theft of household documents, attempted extortion, and procurement of false marital representation to obtain advantage." Barbara rose. She had expected this and still felt the floor shift. Pell continued, reading from paper. "Pending hearing, you are ordered not to leave jurisdiction, not to destroy or conceal records, and to submit any account books in your possession. Failure may result in immediate detention." Lady Helena appeared in the doorway behind them, fully dressed for war in dark blue silk. "Sergeant," she said icily, "you may inform Magistrate Colne that Miss Ross will attend with counsel and witnesses, not as quarry but complainant in turn." Pell's expression did not change. "Ma'am." He handed Finch the notice, bowed because he must, and withdrew. The door closed. No one spoke for 3 beats. Then Finch said very quietly, "They moved faster than I hoped. We have 4 hours." Barbara looked at Wrexham. For a flicker she saw not command but fear, raw, quickly masked, real. She straightened. "Then we use 4 hours," she said. "Send for the innkeeper and the coachman if he can stand." Finch blinked. "Miss Ross, today is defensive. We may not even be granted full statement." "Then I will ask," she said, "in open court." Outside, a newsboy shouted something about an Earl's adventuress and fresh scandal at Bow Street. Wheels were already gathering in the square. Wrexham stepped closer, voice low enough for her alone. "If at any point you want me to stop this," she met his eyes, Do not corner me. A breath. Never! By noon, the house had become a corridor of motion. Gowns changed for plain dark wool, bundles of papers tied, subpoenas drafted, servants sent running. In her room, Barbara slipped her father's ledger beneath her cloak and felt its weight settle against her ribs like a second spine. When she descended, Lady Helena kissed her forehead once, quickly, as if sealing a blade. The carriage door closed. As they rolled toward Bow Street through a city eager for spectacle, Barbara kept one hand over the hidden leather and watched the crowd thicken ahead of them. Curious faces, pamphlets raised, men already deciding what she must be. For the first time since the inn, she did not feel speechless. She felt the edge of battle. Bow Street was already thick with bodies when their carriage turned in. Newsboys darted between wheels shouting fragments, "Earl's false wife! Blackthorn fraud!" While gentlemen who had never entered a magistrate's office in their lives stood on tiptoe for a better look at the door. Rain had slicked the paving stones to mirror dark shine. Barbara stepped down without waiting for help, one hand under her cloak on the ledger pressed against her ribs. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool, ink, and old wood. Clerks moved briskly with stacks of folded papers. Constables spoke in low, carrying voices designed to imply order where there was mostly noise. At the far end, under the magistrate's bench, Lady Ross sat in black silk and widow's lace, as if she were attending a matinee staged for her comfort. Mr. Pritchard occupied the next chair, broad, pink, and complacent, gloved hands folded over a cane topped with carved ivory. When he saw Barbara, he smiled with damp possession. Wrexham went still beside her. Finch touched his sleeve once. A warning. Not yet. "Miss Ross," called the clerk, "step forward." She did. Magistrate Colner was a narrow man with pale lashes and the exhausted impatience of one who considered all emotion an inconvenience. He adjusted his spectacles, glanced at the papers before him, and began in a tone that suggested he had already formed 3 opinions, and none favoured her. "Barbara Ross, you are brought on allegations of theft of household documents from Lady Ross, attempted extortion of the Earl of Wrexham, and fraudulent representation of marital status for gain. How do you answer?" "Not guilty," Barbara said. "Counsel for complainant." Lady Ross's attorney stood, bowed, and launched into polished cruelty. Miss Ross, unstable after bereavement, long history of disobedience, removal of private papers, calculated seduction of an injured peer, recent attempts to intimidate creditors with fabricated testamentary claims. He produced affidavits from dismissed grooms, copies of debt notes, and the seized letter mentioning a codicil conveniently discovered. Each phrase was crafted to sound less like accusation than common sense. Cole nodded. "Counsel for Miss Ross?" Finch rose. "My client denies all charges and intends counter-complaint for forgery and coercion. We ask leave." Colne lifted a hand. "This is preliminary. I'm not trying the entire county this afternoon." Lady Ross let out a small, satisfied sigh. Barbara felt something in her settle, not fear exactly, and focus. She stepped forward before Finch could be cut off again. "Sir," she said, "if this is preliminary, then surely the question is whether there is probable cause to hold me as a criminal. I can answer that, with records in this room, in less than an hour, if you permit me to speak." Colne looked irritated. "You are not counsel." "No," Barbara said. "I'm the person accused of arithmetic impossible enough to be criminal in someone else's hand." A ripple moved through the room. Colne frowned, then tapped the desk. 10 minutes. "Thank you." She untied the ledger with fingers that had stopped shaking. The worn leather looked almost indecently plain among the polished dispatch boxes. She laid it open and turned it toward the bench. "This is my father's household and estate ledger in his hand. Entries span 12 years. Columns balanced monthly. Witnessed by steward and clerk. Your officer did not seize it because he did not find it. Pell, standing at the rear, stiffened. Lady Ross's attorney said sharply, "Your worship, this document has no chain of custody." Barbara did not look at him. "Then test it. Compare ink, dates, paper age, hand. But first, read." Colne leaned despite himself. "Proceed." She guided him to a page dated 7 months before her father's death. "Here are rents due from East tenants, carried into winter quarter. Here is corresponding disbursement to Mr. Pritchard on short-term note, principal 600. Interest due quarterly at 4%. She set beside it one of Lady Ross's debt instruments. "This copy claims principal of 1100 for the same quarter, with interest calculated monthly at 6, then compounded backward into months before the note existed." Colne blinked. "Backward?" Barbara turned another page. "My father's entry here records payment in full of that note 2 quarters later, witnessed by Steward Toller and Clerk Ames. Yet Lady Ross's copy shows the note renewed 3 months after payment, with my dead father's signature dated 2 weeks after his burial." The clerk at Colne's elbow made a small involuntary sound. Lady Ross's attorney rose half out of his chair. "Speculation, not speculation," Barbara said, finally looking at him. "Calendar." She reached for another paper. "And this second instrument bears revenue stamp issue from a series released the year after that date. Either my father predicted stamp policy from the grave, or someone purchased fresh paper and hoped no one who keeps books would notice." A laugh escaped from the back benches before being strangled. Colne rapped the desk. "Order!" Barbara drew a breath. "You were also told I stole household papers to fabricate a codicil. I have no codicil in hand. I have a reference to one in correspondence from a clerk who found irregular registry notes. If I forged this claim, I did so by planting county entries years in advance and persuading 2 dead men to initial margins in matching ink." Colne's pale lashes flickered. "You refer to Steward Toller. He is unavailable." "Because someone removed him," Barbara said. Gasps, louder this time. Pritchard shifted, face blotching. "Miss Ross," Colne warned. "Then call witnesses who are available." She turned. "Mr. Hale?" The innkeeper, cap crushed in both hands, shuffled from the side where Finch had kept him waiting. He looked terrified of everyone equally. "State what you saw on the night in question," Finch prompted. Hale swallowed. "Miss Ross come in near froze through, half carrying his lordship with blood down his coat. She shouted for hot water afore she asked price, tore her own garment for bandage, sat up all night, didn't leave." "Did you hear her demand marriage, money, title?" Hale stared. "No, sir, beg pardon. Heard nowt like that." "Did you hear Lord Wrexham identify her?" "Yes, sir, said she was his wife. To stop talk, I reckon. There was talk." Colne turned to Wrexham. "My lord." Wrexham stood, pain visible in the set of his shoulder, but voice clear. "I spoke the word to protect Miss Ross from immediate slander in a room full of men eager for it. She did not solicit, suggest, or exploit it. If fault lies, it lies with me." Lady Ross made a choking sound. "How noble to be duped!" Barbara ignored her. "Coachman Mason!" Mason came forward with a healing bruise yellowed along his temple. He bowed awkwardly. "Miss Ross dragged me from ditch first, sir, then him. I was senseless part of it. Woke at inn with surgeon cursing that she'd tied the wound better than his apprentice." A grin flashed and vanished in the room. Colne's mouth thinned. He looked from witness to papers to Barbara. 10 minutes has become 30. "Then I'll finish," she said. "You were given affidavits from 2 grooms dismissed by Lord Wrexham. Ask the stable ledger where they were the night they claimed to have heard me boasting in the inn-yard. One was on Post Road to Reading with a broken axle. One signed for fever physic in the servants' hall at Blackthorn. Their own signatures contradict their testimony. Finch set both records on the clerk's desk with quiet satisfaction. Lady Ross rose abruptly, silk whispering like a blade. "This is theatre. She has always been theatrical. A plain girl can only rule by pity and figures." Barbara turned to her at last. "No," she said, "a plain girl can also count." Colne called recess. No one left. The room held that dangerous electric stillness of public appetite when it scents blood turning. Lady Ross's attorney bent over her in furious whisper. Pritchard dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief and sent his clerk scurrying out a side door. Pell stood rigid near the wall, suddenly less certain of his morning's swagger. When Colne returned, his impatience had become caution. "Further submissions," he said curtly. Lady Ross's attorney sprang up first, abandoning elegance for aggression. "Your worship, even if arithmetic errors exist, and we do not concede, they do not erase Miss Ross's theft, nor her attempt to leverage intimacy with a peer. We move that she be remanded while provenance is tested. She has admitted concealing key documents." He jabbed a finger toward the ledger as if it were a snake. Finch rose. "Concealment from abusers is not theft from the court. My client brought the ledger voluntarily, requested scrutiny, and provided witnesses under oath. We move dismissal of criminal allegations and immediate inquiry into forged instruments and coercive marriage demands." Pritchard could bear no more. He lumbered up, red and sweating. "I offered the girl rescue, respectability. She owes—" Colne snapped. "Sit down, sir, unless called." Pritchard sat with a grunt, eyes small and murderous on Barbara. Lady Ross stood without leave, voice pitched high enough to crack. "You all forget she is under my authority. Ungrateful, deceitful. She has stolen from my desk, slandered me in every drawing-room, and now parades herself beside this man as if rank can wash filth." "Lady Ross," Colne warned. She pressed on, near shrieking now. "Adrian, for God's sake, correct your creature!" The words hung in the room like a slap. Wrexham's face went white with controlled fury. He half moved. Barbara lifted her hand without looking at him. He stopped. That obedience, instant public, dropped to silence more complete than the magistrate's gavel could have managed. Barbara faced the bench. "Sir, I ask the record note that language, and not because it insults me, because it clarifies the method. Lady Ross's position has always been that my person is transferable property, from father to guardian to creditor to husband, with my consent optional and my accounts inaccessible." She set both palms on the rail, steady. "I refuse that position. I refuse immediate marriage as settlement of fraud. I refuse rescue purchased by surrender. Before any question of my future is discussed by anyone, I ask this court to order examination of the disputed instruments, release of trust, review from coercive petition, and restoration of my legal right to the dower house and dowry, if the codicil is verified, on my own name first. Then whatever else follows can be honest." Colne stared at her a long moment. The clerk's pen scratched furiously. At length the magistrate spoke, each word clipped. "Criminal detention is denied. Miss Ross is not remanded. Allegations of theft and extortion are suspended pending full accounting inquiry." A rustle, shocked and immediate. He continued, "Given apparent defects in the debt instruments, I order temporary injunction against enforcement actions by Mr. Pritchard or Lady Ross against Miss Ross until examination concludes. Seized papers are to be copied to both parties. Bow Street will take statements regarding the disappearance of Steward Toller and assault at his cottage." Pritchard surged up. "You cannot freeze my notes on a girl's theatrics." Collins slammed the desk with his palm. "I can and have. Another word and I hold you in contempt." Pritchard sat. Lady Ross had gone oddly still, colour draining beneath powder. When she spoke again, her voice was low and venomous. "You think this vindicates you? Society will still call you what you are." Barbara met her gaze. "Then society will need better arithmetic." For one wild second it seemed Lady Ross might strike her. She took a step forward, fingers curled. Pell moved between them. "Enough, my lady." Lady Ross recoiled as if touched by sewage. "Do not my lady me like a fishwife." "No," Pell said flatly. "Today I'll do exactly that." She stood rigid, chest heaving, then gathered her skirts and turned away before anyone could offer her arm. Pritchard followed, stumbling over the threshold while whispers rose like wind through reeds. Outside Bow Street the crowd had doubled. Word moved faster than law. By the time Barbara reached the steps, faces were already changing from prurient delight to disappointed fascination. A woman in a red shawl called, "Give 'em hell, miss!" and got elbowed silent by her husband. Reporters pushed forward with notebooks. Finch barked names and threatened libel in 3 directions at once. Wrexham did not touch Barbara until they reached the carriage door. Then, very lightly, he set his hand at her back. Inside, when the door shut and noise dulled to a murmur, Barbara realised she was trembling in violent, delayed waves. "I did not know," she said to no one, "that anger could keep one upright that long." Lady Helena, opposite, gave a sharp nod. "Useful fuel, poor supper." Finch leaned in through the window before it closed. "We've won the first gate, not the field. Trustees meet tomorrow at 10. Bring everything." Barbara nodded. "I will." As the carriage jolted into motion, Wrexham looked at her, not speaking until they were clear of the square. "You stopped me," he said quietly. "Yes." "Thank you," she turned her head. "For what?" "For not letting me turn your victory into mine." It was the truest thing he could have said. She leaned back against the squabs and closed her eyes for 3 breaths. Ledger still under her cloak, heart still racing. At 10 the next morning she sat at a long mahogany table opposite 3 trustees who had spent months not answering her letters. Sunlight struck dust in precise shafts. Ink dried on legal pads. No crowd this time, no newsboys, no spectacle, just men who managed wealth and called it prudence. The eldest trustee, Mr. Bellamy, cleared his throat. "Miss Ross, yesterday's proceedings raise serious concerns. We must protect the estate from irregular claim." Barbara set out the ledger, clerk's correspondence, copies of stamped notes, and her father's margin entries, with the calm of a surgeon laying instruments. "Protect it, then," she said, "by reading." They read. An hour later, the youngest trustee, who had avoided her eye all morning, said hoarsely, "God help us! The codicil references a line." Bellamy took off his spectacles. If verified at registry, Miss Ross's dowry trust and life interest in the dower house were wrongfully suppressed. "Suppressed by whom?" Barbara asked. No one answered because they did not need to. Bellamy replaced his spectacles with hands less steady than before. "Pending final certification, we vote to restore interim access to Miss Ross's dowry income and grant immediate possession of the dower house to prevent further prejudice." He looked up. "Miss Ross, we regret delay." Barbara held his gaze. "Regret is cheap, Mr. Bellamy. Competence costs more." "I suggest you pay in that coin." Lady Helena made a small sound that might have been a cough and might have been approval. 2 months later, the dower house smelled of limewash, beeswax, and new beginnings. It stood on the edge of Blackthorn Fields, modest beside the great house, but built with better sense. Low eaves, deep windows, a kitchen that held heat, A front passage paved in old marble, now dulled by neglect and hauling crates. Barbara stood in that passage in rolled sleeves while 2 village carpenters argued cheerfully over shelves. "Higher!" she said, pointing. "Girls grow!" One carpenter grinned. "Aye, miss, beg pardon, ma'am." "Barbara is fine until you track mud," she said. "Then I become formidable." He laughed and adjusted the bracket. In what had once been a formal morning room, 6 plain tables stood in 2 rows. Slates, chalk, and copybooks waited in neat stacks. At the far wall she had hung a map of England and a smaller one of the world, both repaired with paste at the folds. Tenant girls would begin next Monday, reading figures, accounts, letters, enough to prevent them being sold lies disguised as sums. She heard wheels in the yard and went to the window. Wrexham arrived without escort beyond his groom, as he had done on each proper call since the trustees' ruling. Announced punctual, never assuming welcome, always asking. He came in carrying a narrow package wrapped in brown paper. "For the schoolroom," he said by way of greeting, "if permitted." She took the parcel, untied the string, and found a set of abacus frames, polished wood and brass rods gleaming. "Useful weaponry," she said. "I had excellent instruction recently." They walked the rooms together, not touching, easy in the space between words. He asked where she wanted the cupboard, whether the older girls might help the younger with copywork, what hours she meant to hold. Questions always, no declarations disguised as plans. In the doorway of the schoolroom he paused. "I have been doing this badly for weeks," he said. "Courting? Existing." She smiled despite herself. "Specificity helps." He took a breath that seemed to cost him. "I love you." No preface, no armour. The room went very quiet around them. "I loved you before I understood what it was, which is inconvenient for a man fond of understanding first. I loved you when you told me to walk instead of dying politely in a ditch. I loved you when you skewered that Viscount's son. I loved you yesterday when you refused my opinion on paint colour and were right." Her throat tightened. She said nothing. He went on, voice roughening. "I do not want gratitude. I do not want debt. I do not want to become the next authority over your life and call it devotion. I want partnership with a woman who frightens fools and balances columns in her head." Now she was laughing and crying at once, furious at both. He reached into his coat and drew out a small velvet box, then, because he had learned, did not open it yet. "If you do not wish marriage, say so, and I will still come Tuesday to discuss the tenant leases if invited. If you do wish it, I am asking plainly. Barbara Ross, will you marry me?" No witnesses. No urgency, but honesty. She wiped her cheeks with the heel of her hand, annoyed at tears, then met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "on one condition." His eyebrows lifted. "Name it." No rescue language at the wedding breakfast. A startled laugh broke out of him, warm and young enough to startle them both. Agreed. He opened the box. The ring was old, a family stone reset in a simple band, elegant without ostentation. He slid it onto her finger with hands that were not perfectly steady. When he bent his head, he did it slowly enough for refusal. She closed the distance herself. After, forehead against hers, he whispered, "Thank you." She drew back just enough to answer clearly, "Not rescue, my lord. Choice." "Choice," he said. On a bright autumn morning, Lady Ross sat in a hired sitting room off Half Moon Street, curtains faded, grate, meanly warm, while a card tray held exactly one invitation, to a tea hosted by a woman desperate enough to invite anyone still whispered about. Her solicitor stood by the mantel, reading aloud from the latest notice. "Trustees have finalised restitution. The dower house is no longer contestable. Your appeal on procedural grounds is unlikely to succeed. Lady Ross's jaw tightened. Unlikely is not impossible. Funds, my lady, he said gently, are now very nearly impossible. She turned her face to the window so he would not see the tremor at her mouth. In the glass, powdered and jewelled and carefully upright, she looked like a portrait no one had room to hang. At Blackthorn, mister. Pritchard watched two clerks carry his ledgers into the office of a receiver appointed after his speculative loans failed under scrutiny. He shouted about conspiracies, ingratitude, female manipulation, and was ignored with professional efficiency. Your claim against Miss Ross is void, the receiver said. Stamped instruments defective. Interest schedules unconscionable. Good day. By noon, Pritchard had been shown the door of his own counting room. In the Dower House schoolroom, none of this was discussed. Barbara stood at the front table while 12 girls between 8 and 14 bent over slates, tongues peeking from concentration. Little Annie Toller, Stuart Toller recovered, weak but alive, and now living with his daughter, held up her board triumphantly. Ma'am, 7 times 8 is 56. Barbara nodded. Correct. And if someone tells you 7 times 8 is 64 because he is older and louder, Annie grinned, he's a liar. Precisely. Laughter ran through the room. At the door, Lady Helena watched with dry-eyed ferocity and pretended not to be proud. Wrexham stood beside her, hat in hand, smiling without restraint. When lessons ended and boots thudded down the steps, Barbara gathered slates into neat stacks and carried them into the front passage. Evening light pooled on the marble floor, pale and veined. For a heartbeat, she saw herself as she had been, on her knees before dawn, hungry, scrubbing someone else's mud in a house that called her burdensome. Now she stood upright, sleeves chalk-dusted instead of soaked, keys warm at her belt, ledger and lesson books waiting on her own hall table. Behind her, voices she loved moved through rooms she had claimed without surrendering herself to claim them. Wrexham came up beside her and followed her gaze to the stone. Thinking hard, he said. Remembering, she answered. He offered his arm, not as command, but invitation. Barbara Ross, Lady Wrexham by choice, took it, and together they walked forward across the marble into the light.